is Elizabeth Porter, and I am here to talk to you about performance-based assessment, teaching with thematic units and natural assessment. I am really excited to talk to you about this today. I absolutely 100% believe that teaching through thematic units is the way to go, and performance-based learning and performance-based assessment are essential for education in today's world. So I'm really excited to talk to you. I want to introduce myself to you a little bit. Like I said, my name is Elizabeth Porter. I am the Director of Curriculum Instruction and International Programs at Bon Voyage World Languages Academy. I have a master's degree in elementary education, as well as degrees in French and linguistics, and I specialize in curriculum and performance-based assessment. I am also the author of a book called Pathways to Language Fluency, and that I will give you a link to at the end of the presentation. So let's talk about why I do not like testing, why testing is not a great measure of achievement or of learning. First of all, testing causes anxiety. I don't know about you, but I have massive test anxiety, and when you hear the word test, or when a child or a student hears the word test, it's really likely that the student is going to feel a certain amount of anxiety. So it's really important that we don't test our students anymore, because anxiety can get in the way of actual learning and actual showing of knowledge and progress and all of the things that we actually need to measure in order to see how the student has progressed, how the student has retained the information, etc. I just believe it's not an active measure. And because I'm a language teacher, I have some language terms in here. It's not an accurate measure of linguistic advancement. It's not a measure of any advancement, right? So it shows us how well a student can take a test, or it shows us how well a student can memorize information, but it doesn't show us how the student can actually apply the learning in a real world setting. So the goal here is to have a student not necessarily show knowledge by memorization and memorizing of facts, or being able to perform well on a test. We want to see that the students can actually apply their knowledge to a situation that they might encounter in the real world. And so that's why I say students should apply and not regurgitate. And a lot of people say, well, creating a performance-based learning measure is not easy. It's complicated. It's hard. It takes a lot of time. Yeah, it may take extra time, but the projects don't need to be complicated. They can be simple. And I assess my students constantly without them even knowing I'm assessing them. So I think that this idea that performance-based learning is more work or more complicated, I think it really comes down to the fact that, it's different work. It's different sets of skills, but it's not necessarily more complicated or more work. So what is performance-based assessment or performance-based learning? So this is an assessment or series of tasks that measure student ability to apply skills and knowledge from a thematic unit of study. And this also challenges our students and to use higher order thinking skills in order to create a product or complete a process. So we don't want them to just do that memorization piece. We want them to actually learn, retain, and apply. There are 5 main components of performance-based learning. The first is authenticity. Authenticity. How authentic is the learning? Does it have a place in the real world where it can be applied? Complexity, it's process or product oriented, it's open-ended, and it has a deadline. Okay, so you say open-ended, but it has a deadline. Okay, so open-ended, it means that there's not just one way to come to a conclusion or an answer. The students have the ability to think through and come up with creative solutions to what they're trying to solve. And the fact that it has a deadline, well, in the real world, we have deadlines. We can't just let things go on and on and on. So we want to make sure that the students are working towards a goal that has to be by a certain time. Now, do we have to extend the deadline sometimes? Sure, but it's really important that there's a deadline to these projects. So this is just kind of the gold standard of PBL. This is what project-based teaching practices go into. So what I do is I design and I plan my thematic unit. I align it to the standards. I build the culture of our learning, which I'm going to talk about. I manage the activities of the student learning. I scaffold the student learning. That means I actually give the student exactly what skills need to be learned here and the tools that they're going to use. So I'm asking them to do very specific things built upon other skills that they've learned in the past. I assess the student learning through formative assessments. And I will go over what that means too. I engage and I coach the students, so they bring me what they're working on and I give them ideas, but I never give them the answer. I want them to come out with the answer on their own. So how do we do this? How do we make sure that our students are engaging in these thematic units, and how do we design it so that we make a high quality thematic unit and high quality learning experience for our students? Well, first of all, we have to start with the end in mind. You always start with what specific skills do you want your students to master by the end of the unit? What exactly do you want them to know and be able to do? And I'm going to repeat that because that's important. What exactly do you want them to know first and be able to do with that knowledge? So you want to make sure that you start with your finish line in mind. What is your vision for what these students are going to know and be able to do with that knowledge? There are two types of assessment. The first is formative assessment. Now, formative assessment is basically how you assess the students along the way. You know, a typical type of formative assessment, a traditional type, might be a quiz. As far as in performance-based assessment, we do all sorts of formative assessments. I might have my students play a game using specific skills and watch them play that game and listen and assess them. I might have them create or complete a task, a smaller task. These are formative assessments. Anytime you are taking the temperature of your students' learning, you are doing a formative or engaging in a formative assessment. And then this might be at the end of a particular lesson or during a particular lesson that is part of a whole unit. So formative assessments are kind of the way that, like I say, you gauge student learning, or like I said, take the temperature of your students' learning along the way. A summative assessment is your ending product. That is where you assess the students' learning across lessons for the entire unit. So a summative assessment in the traditional sense might be a final exam. But in performance-based learning, a summative assessment is a project where the student has to apply the learning that they have engaged in during the thematic unit, all through the steps. It's a culmination of all of the learning from the entire unit. So the first thing that I do is when I'm doing this is I have um, a sort of planner that I use. This is my thematic unit planner, and this is the culminating project rubric. And I start out with this. This is what I want them to do. Now for this, I did two different activity ideas. And this is my rough draft. And we're gonna kind of go over the different steps of these, but this is my rough draft. And I adjust this as I go through and plan the unit. So I have an idea of what I want the students to know and be able to do. And then I go through and I start creating this rubric. These are the exact skills that I want them to have. And this is what I want them to do with these skills. And so, as you can see, I have the first one is a language class, is a French class, and the project is un concours de cuisine, so a cooking contest. And the project is that they're going to create or find a recipe, and they are going to create a video of them cooking that recipe. And it's going to be a competition. We're going to have the class present the videos, and then we will choose which recipe we thought looked the best based on different criteria. And so I have several different levels of this. I don't like to use 1, 2, 3, 4 ABCD, so I like to use proficiency based. So a lot of times what I'll use is bravo, bien, bof, or pas du tout in French, or for performance and proficiency based for other subjects. I might use beginner, novice, intermediate, and advanced. Sometimes for younger students, I'll use, different symbols, heart, star, almost not at all. And then, so I decide which parts of this I'm going to use to assess the students. So this is after I know exactly what I want them to do, and then I start working on this, and this is a work in progress for me. I come back to this constantly as I work on the unit. So we'll see it at the end. All right, so the first thing that we're going to do when we create a thematic unit is we have to come up with what are our big ideas. What overarching themes will fit easily with your standards and end results? So what does this mean? First of all, I start out with, it depends on the class. Like, for example, a French class, we have a specific standards that we have to meet at certain levels. And so I might say, okay, well, I'm going to do a thematic unit on school. And these are the ideas. We're going to study the verb être, and we're going to talk about avoir, and we're going to do a vocabulary on school subjects, and we're going to talk about after school activities. So our overarching theme, or our big idea, is going to be school. And then we have to look at our standards. Now, standards don't necessarily need to mean state standards, okay? If you're a public school teacher, then yes, absolutely, you will need to look at state standards, but you can set your own standards. What is it exactly I want my students to learn? What is it I want them to work on? What are the skills that they are going to need to have and be able to use? So we look for that first. The next thing we look at, what are your students' areas of interest? So this is really where it's important to know your students. And if you are a homeschool parent, you absolutely know your students, right? Because they're your own kids. But if you're a public school teacher or an online school teacher, or whatever kind of teacher you are, it is really important that you know your students. If you know you have a student who is really interested in soccer, Well, then you might design a unit around sports or soccer or whatever. You know, this is where it's really important, where you can bring in those little pieces that are important to your students, that are really important for them. And what is relevant to your students in real life. You know, what will, if they're going to travel to France, what are they going to need to know how to do? What kinds of things in their lives are important to them and relevant to them? And then where in real life situations might you see or find your identified standards? So if I'm working on a unit about food in French, for example, I would think about all the places that I might need to bring in real life situations and use those real life situations to build on my unit. For example, at a restaurant, ordering food, going to the grocery store, cooking and making a recipe, all of these real life situations that we can bring in. And then what questions might be answered or problems might be solved through this unit of study. So if you're doing a social studies unit, for example, you might think about, what questions do I have, what questions do my students have about colonization, or about global citizenship, or specifically about global issues, or my place in the world, or my community. So we think through identifying our themes. So here is the first page of the thematic unit plan. And the first one here is a global citizenship education unit. So the area is social studies, and we're talking about, and the standards that I use when I create a social studies unit for global citizenship education are the Sustainable Development Goals from the United Nations. And so these are the sustainable development goals from the United Nations that I am including in my unit. These are the ones that I want to hit. So the big ideas or the overarching themes are going to be myself as a global citizen, privilege. What does it mean? What does privilege mean? Inequality, my place in the world, and poverty. So these are some things that we're going to talk about. Now, this is a middle school age unit. So I would say you could probably do this around 5th grade all the way up to about, I would say 12th grade could even do this, but this starting is about middle school, and you can adapt as needed. So what do I want the students to be able to do? This is the first thing that I think about. I want them to be able to identify and articulate the main components of identity. I want them to articulate how their identity may differ from others, explain how identities may impact privilege and opportunity. So those are the things that I absolutely want them to know. And what we're going to do with those is what I'm working through in this stage. Okay, so this is my thematic unit planner. I like to write this out. This is for me. This is not going to go to anyone else. These are my notes, and this is how I kind of think through these things. And then what cross-curricular connections do we have? So what other areas of curriculum can we bring into this? Well, it's social studies, right? We can bring in humanities, English language arts, civics, history, geography, and even some art, okay? So this is the first step of my brainstorming process, of my preparation process for the thematic unit. Over here, we've got a vocab unit for French. The ideas are celebrations, cooking, and food. So these are the standards. These are what are called the CEFR standards, okay? The Common European Framework of Reference for Languages that we go off of at Bon Voyage. And this is what I want the students to be able to do. I want them to plan a party. I want them to shop for groceries, follow a recipe. I want them to be able to I want them to be able to invite someone somewhere and accept or refuse invitations politely. And then our cross-curricular connections for this one are going to be math, measurement, and the metric system, because in Europe, they use the metric system with recipes and with everything else, as opposed to here in the US, where they use the imperial system. Oh, hold on, my thing is skipping around here. And then lastly, we're going to talk about some civics and some social studies and etiquette, okay? Table etiquette, words for etiquette, being polite, etc. So the next part of this is that we're going to map our unit, and I like to use mind mapping to get all of my ideas out on paper. Once I get that out, I start creating and organizing a scope and sequence to order all of the competencies and the skills that I want the students to learn. And then I go even further and order the lessons in the unit plan. So here are my mind maps for both of these units. This is for me. Again, these are my notes. This is how I do this. You do a list. You can do whatever works for you to get all of these ideas out. So I place my main idea in the middle. So on this one over here, we have my place in the world. And my place in the world is divided into different sections. Like, what questions do I have? Like, what factors shape our identities? Local, we talk about local politics, industry, your town, changes that I can make in our nation and in our world, and the problems that all of these places have. So I go through and I write all of these out. And in fact, this is kind of cut off because I could only fit a certain amount in here. Like, I tend to go crazy with these. Our main idea here on the second one is on fait la fête, which is we're going to have a party. And I'm looking at all of the different types of competencies that I want them: communication, vocabulary, grammar, sound. So what sounds do I want them to learn in the language? The recipes, what is their project? What are they going to do? What questions do we have? All sorts of different ideas here in a jumble. And the main thing is just to get everything out on paper, get it out of my brain, get it onto the paper. And this is, like I said, this is just how I do it, but it really, really helps to get every single idea out. It doesn't mean you have to use that idea. You may have too much to use. I tend to overdo it a little bit, I think, and I tend to have a little bit more to use than I really need. And then the next part is I start my scope and sequence. And again, these are my notes. This is what I work on. So I have two different templates here for scope and sequence. I have the world language thematic unit, and I have the just a regular thematic unit one. So for example, in the this is me in the personal identity, the first lesson is this is me, and we're going to talk about key competencies are personal identity, identifying where we get our identity and the resources we're going to use. So feel free, this doesn't all have to come out of your own brain. Feel free to use as many resources as you can find. There are great resources out there on the internet for you to use, and it's really important that you use those resources that you find, because you don't always have to reinvent the wheel. I happen to like reinventing the wheel because I like to write curriculum, but I often will also use other resources that are out there. So as you can see, we have final tasks, and not every lesson has a final task, because I'm not always, sometimes I'm doing just small check-ins, small, small activities where I am just gauging from my own mind, how the students are doing here. Next, we have our unit plan. So this is where the lessons come into play. We start, naming our lessons, planning our lessons, and giving them a duration. Now, those of you out there probably know that you can give a lesson a duration, and sometimes it takes way less time, sometimes it takes way more time. So this is an estimate. You don't have to, you know, stick 100% to the time that you put on there. This is like, I think it's going to take an hour. If it takes 2 hours, that's fine. And the thing with thematic units is that the time limit really can be adjusted, because you want to make sure that your students are actually, you know, retaining that information instead of pushing them to get done with stuff. We want to make sure that when we do this, it's done to a high enough quality where the students really engage with it and understand. And that's what's important about thematic units, is because it gets the students really 100% participating and engaged in their own learning. And so if they're really interested in a part of this, that, you know, you only planned 2 hours to do this, but they're really, really into it and they're learning, just keep going with it. On the other hand, if something just isn't working, don't push it. You know, you can always move on to something else. If you see that an activity is just bombing, then it's okay too for that. So the next thing is you're going to plan your individual lessons, and that's exactly what the students will do in each lesson and how they will each build upon the other. So when you start with your first lesson, it's going to be kind of an introduction, and then the second lesson will build upon the first. The third lesson will build upon the first two. So they all build upon each other, and by the end, you come together and they have what they will need to know how to do before the culminating project, which is a culmination of all of those lessons together. So I've been teaching for over 20 years now, and so I don't need to have as much detail in my lesson plans. A lot of times I'll tweak them a little bit, but I don't really need to write a lot of detail in the lesson plan itself. I'm also really good at winging it. So for those of you who are new teachers or new to teaching, or you just need to have a lot of detail, then do it the way that you feel comfortable. This is just me, and these are my lesson plans. So this is, for example, my place in the world, and I don't have to write all of the steps down of what I will do. But a lot of times, teachers, when they're in school, when they're learning to be teachers and still in college or grad school, the way that you write a lesson plan is to write out every single step of your lesson. And most teachers get it down to a point where they can just stand up and they know what they're going to do just by having an idea in their brain. But this is, these are a couple of lesson plans. This one was for my place in the world. These are the lesson objectives. This is the materials that I'm going to use. This is what they're going to do at the end. And this is the description of what exactly the students will do in the lesson. So this would be, if you're going to write out every single step, this is where you would write it out. This lesson plan over here is for On fait la fête. And again, these are the kind of the steps, and they're going to go on a grocery store scavenger hunt at the end of that. And then we write our rubric. So I started the rubric at the beginning. This is where I'm going to actually write it out for the students. So this is my my rough draft, and then I actually type it out for the students. We set a maximum of 4 benchmarks. You don't want any more than 4 benchmarks. The benchmarks are the ones that are up here, so they can actually see how they did. We're going to define what those benchmarks look like. So, for example, they are clear. They are the student shows a passion for what they're doing. You know, you can set them however you feel like your students will respond. But we want to make sure that they're clear so that the students can say, hey, this is exactly what my project has to look like, or this is exactly what I have to do in order to get a red heart on this. And like I said, provide the rubric to the students so they are fully aware of your standards and expectations. Um, this is a great way to show your student progress over time, is creating a student portfolio. So for every single unit that you do with your students, you save their work, you save their projects, and that way you can see their progress over time. And that's great for you, but it also showcases their work. It's a great way for them to see how they've progressed over time. So this could be over a school year. This could be over, you know, the beginning of French 1 to the end of French 4. And it's a great way for them to see. And not only that, it's something that they can keep and use in the future to show what they've accomplished. And you can do this in a physical or a digital. You know, you can get some of those hanging folders and do portfolios that way. But I love Google Classroom. Google Classroom is free for everyone to use as part of G Suite. It is an excellent resource, and I absolutely love Google Classroom for organizing student work and keeping it together. So anyway, I want to thank everyone here for listening. If you would like to know more, I have a full training on performance-based assessment. I also have lots and lots of resources on the website, and I would love to talk with you. You can set up a coaching session with me. I am a great resource for you if you need a little extra help or want to sit with me for 30